Well, the problem for the Conservatives is that the elections that are taking place this year are, for the most part, though not entirely, for seats and positions that were last fought over in May 2021. Elections, indeed, that have been postponed for 12 months as a consequence of the pandemic. Now, it doubtless will pain many a Labour supporter to be reminded that that was the very day on which the party lost the Hartlepool by-election to the Conservatives, a seat they'd managed to win in the general election, but they then lost 2 years later. And indeed, in the wake of what certainly looks like it being something of a post-vaccine bounce, the government was about 6 points ahead in the opinion polls and made net gains of councils and seats, which doesn't happen that often for a party that is in government. And of course, in the immediate wake of that, the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer attempted to reshuffle his shadow cabinet. That, shall we say, led to something of a relatively public spat with the Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, and Labour's position in opinion polls indeed weakened further thereafter. So this was not an easy time for Labour. It was, however, around the time when we were getting Sunday newspaper stories of the kind of, well, Boris Johnson thinks he might be in office for 10 years and he's developing a plan for that. Well, it all now seems like the dim and distant past, but it does therefore mean that the Conservatives are defending a relatively high baseline. And Labour, in contrast, therefore, ought to be making gains, even if they're not doing spectacularly well. That said, we should remember that many of these contests are in areas which are already controlled by Labour, at least as far as the council elections are concerned. It's true of most of the metro mayors. It's true of London. Nearly half of the local government council elections that have been fought are places where Labour are already in control. The Conservatives only currently have 2 of the metro mayors, and of course, they don't have very much in London. So don't expect very much in the way of headline-grabbing Labour gains. Probably the biggest plum that Labour might hope to pick up is Dudley, which, like a number of councils, is amongst the councils where control of is more likely to occur because it's a whole council election because of board boundary changes rather than a one-third election, which is what's true elsewhere, which again is one of the reasons we're not going to get a great deal of headline-grabbing changes of control. Now, one estimate has said that perhaps the Conservatives might lose as many as 500 of the nearly 1,000 seats they're trying to defend, and Labour perhaps pick up 300. I think at this point, however, 2 notes of caution. Note of caution number 1 about expecting perhaps Conservative losses on quite the scale that some people have been talking about is that we now know that Reform are only fighting around 1 in 6 of the local council contests. They are contesting London, contesting the West Midlands, which might be significant, and Greater Manchester, but they're not contesting the rest of the metro mayors. They're only contesting a couple of the PCC contests. And therefore, it's not unreasonable to anticipate, at least, given that it is Reform rather than Labour these days who are picking up more in the way of people who voted Conservative in 2019, that some of these folk, at least, who are minded to vote Reform in the general election may well vote for the Conservatives in the local elections, ? And if they do, then the Conservative losses will not necessarily be on the scale of the opinion polls. In any event, we also know, not least because both the Liberal Democrats and the Greens tend to do better in local elections than they would do in a general election, Labour never really pull off the kind of performance in opinion polls. So you take the swing between 2021 and 2023 locals, it was the order on average around 8%, whereas you would expect a double-digit swing in the opinion polls. So I think there is a risk for Labour of expectations being too high. That said, Labour in the end, they didn't do particularly well last year. Particularly quite remarkably, their own share of the vote didn't really increase on the position 12 months previously, even though the Liz Truss fiscal event had been in between the two, which obviously pushed Labour's national poll positions. So I think in the end of the day, rather than getting too hooked up in what positions are won and lost and who gains councils, etc. What I'm looking for really is three things. One, is Labour's own share of the vote up on where it was in these contests in 2022 and 2023? And secondly, what I'm looking for is the evidence that was there in last year's local elections and which has been picked up by a number of the so-called MRP polling exercises, which is a pattern whereby the Conservatives are losing ground more heavily in places where they were previously strongest, and where this is something that polling can't pick up at this stage, and where there was also evidence last year of voters voting tactically against the Conservatives for either Labour or the Democrats. Are those patterns there? In other words, it's the material that's underneath the headlines, the things that you only see once you start looking at the votes rather than getting caught up under seats and changes of control. That's, I think, where the real lessons are potentially going to be. One, in a sense, is a clear test for Labour, and the other two are, as it were, question marks about potential warning signs for the Conservatives.
Okay, so I'm sure that the next day, on the 3rd of May, we're going to get used to hearing Conservative spokespeople saying there's a poor turnout, that people don't turn up for these elections, they don't care about local politics, they will turn up for the main election. Is that something that you think will happen like we see every time? And how accurate is the turnout, really? I mean, for these elections, is it fairly consistent? And does that help you try to position a general election?
Dan, if I was given £1 for every time the people who hadn't done terribly well in the parliamentary by-election or local election said, but the turnout was low, I would be a rich person. It's a common excuse, and it is remarkable how the political parties seem to lack sufficient ingenuity that they can never really think of much more to say than that. And even though you point out that that's what everybody says, they still carry on saying it. Well, I guess they've got to think of something to say. No, I mean, what is true, what is important? Local elections should not be used to project what the result of the general election would be. As I already said, Liberal Democrats are always doing better in local elections. Labour tend to do less well in particular. The Greens do better. Last year's local elections, if you actually kind of put them through the standard naughty arithmetic, you'd say, oh, well, there might be a hung parliament. Well, it really isn't how we should look at them. The thing it's important to do is to compare local elections with local elections, low turnout elections, therefore, with low turnout elections. And once you start doing that, you cannot blame low turnout as an excuse, because you've still got that doesn't explain why you've done badly in these low turnout elections as compared with doing well in previous ones. And I don't think the Conservative Party, for example, were particularly unhappy to point out how well they had done in 2021 when the turnout was relatively low. So the point is, so long as we are careful about what we compare with what, and the extrapolations and the interpretations we draw, then in itself, turnout is not a low turnout is not a barrier. Of course, it's not unreasonable to say that it may well be true that Conservative voters may be somewhat more likely to stay at home than Labour voters, but that's a symptom. It's not an automatic remedy come a general election.
Okay, and then when you see a party saying the local election was this, which means you can extrapolate that the national election is that, is that even a comparable thing we should do, or just avoid?
Don't forget it. Don't
forget it. Yeah.
Don't do it.